Hello and welcome everyone. It's been 14 days since the Kickstarter campaign has ended, and I just got notified from Kickstarter that the funds have been processed. So now it's up for us to start with the vote on the settings. If you remember correctly, through the Kickstarter campaign, you unlocked 7 additional settings that Caeora is going to draw for you. And we didn't want to decide on them just for ourselves, but we wanted to have you to vote on the settings that you would like to see realized. So in the past week, Caeora and the rest of the team, surprisingly, suddenly everyone tapped in, and we had Guy in the meeting, and we had Janet and Dimi from their vacation directly in our meeting. And we all sat down and took all your votings. I think it has been over 125 requests that came in through Discord and the Kickstarter comments. And 125 is way too much. So we sat down and created a condensed list that makes sense for us and that makes sense for you to vote on. And since it's kind of complicated, possibly, we decided to do a little video about that. Mark, why don't you tell a little bit about the process behind this list?
Sure. So the first thing you're going to see when you open up the voting little form is basically a little section that explains, well, not the first thing, but one of the first things is how the settings work. So there was a bit of confusion in the community, or in the general people that have voted for the or back the Kickstarter, about what settings actually are. So just quickly, we're just going to explain that settings are not like a single unique building. Those things will be done as, like just a single asset or a single prop. What settings are they are an entire world. So you could do an entire world with a single setting. So the Dark House, the Sonata people that are doing
Dead House
Sonata, they want a dark vampire setting that could be technically an entire world, but that can also be mixed and matched with other things that we're doing as well. So all of the settings that you're going to be voting on can be created. You can create an entire world with them, okay? And you can see further on in the voting list all the different things that are going to be contained in a setting. So that includes things like landmarks for region and world maps, battle map props, space things, although, we're still going to be doing those later on and all the rest of it. And also things to do with, like biome tools. So that's what settings are, okay? They are a whole big thing, and that's what you're voting on in this form.
Yeah, exactly. So it has been discussed a lot in the Discord. So we know that people are confused about the fact what is a setting and what is an asset pack.
Yeah.
And the example I have been giving in Discord was, think of a world where the setting is called Ancient Empires. This setting is not specifically Greek buildings or Greek worlds or Roman worlds, but this is a world where Greco-Roman buildings are, where possibly Viking buildings are, Mesoamerican, Egyptian. So a world consists of a lot of different themes and assets that come into play, but also biomes, like you need forests and mountains. Now, the challenge was that a lot of those settings, they share the same pool of biomes. Because if you think of an Earth-based world, the biomes are the same. Like you always have the same forests, you always have the same mountains, you always have the same swamps or grasslands or icelands. So those biomes, they don't make sense to be repeatedly done for each setting if the setting is shared from the same pool, like, for example, Earth-based. Whereas assets, they do make sense to differ because it depends on the time zone of, or like not the time zone, but the timeline of where in Earth history is this world based. So it is important if this is 2000 years before Christ, or if this is around zero, what do you say, zero AC, zero BC? I don't know. Or if it is medieval or Victorian time or post-apocalyptic but earth-based. So you have requested a lot of stuff there, and we tried to take that and create a sorting. And I'm going to, I don't know where, somewhere here, I'm going to show you the outcome of that. And the idea was to really cover as much of Earth-based history, as well as fantasy, as well as things that might be not fantasy related, but rather sci-fi related. So the list you're looking at is basically what we tried to do to collect all your votes and organize them. So I think, let me just check because I need to look at the list. Let's quickly go through that. History of Earth. We have the lost civilizations. In one sentence, we have the root of civilization and ancient empires from the mists of time. Mark, what do you picture when you hear that?
So Lost Civilizations is going to encompass quite a lot of different things that people have requested, just like all of the other voting things. But I envision something along the lines of, you know, ancient, very, very old sort of civilizations, you know, like the Greeks, Egyptians, you know, you've got some very, very Stone Age sort of buildings, more sort of, you know, the very, very dawn of civilization sort of stuff.
Technically, a little bit like Hyboria, Conan style, right?
Very much so, yes.
Almost tapping into Lost World where dinosaurs still roam the place, where you have
Yes.
Babylonian buildings, something like that.
If you want dinosaurs, this is the perfect one to go for. So bear that in mind, because this is going to be sort of incorporated into that as well.
Yeah. And again, since it is, I mean, this is one of the things where we still have to experiment with it, because talking about biomes, this might be a setting where some additional biomes make sense, because if you think of dinosaurs and giant ferns and giant jungles of the prehistoric times, then this might make sense to have some additional settings in there. But mainly, and that's why we've showed that in the list, but mainly this is going to be heavy on landmarks and assets.
Yes.
Then we move on in time into wondrous empires, the age of myth and wonders, pyramids, temples, pagodas, fantastical creatures. Mark, what's jumping into your vision when you think about that?
Well, basically, when you're looking at the history of Doggo!
Doggo!
Don't worry about Doggo. When you're looking at the wondrous empires and you're thinking, why should I vote for that one, or what do I get from that one? Basically, that's a little bit further on. So now we're looking at empires that are a lot more established, and there's a lot more mythological things going on. You've got stuff from Chinese or Japanese mythology, and you've got all the flying Chinese dragons, and you might have an asset for that, or you might have their buildings and architecture as assets, or buildings in the building thing. And you're also going to have things like Romans, and all the kind of very Vikings and things as well are going to probably be in this one instead, because it's more mythical, to have sort of like, you know, the Norse pantheon and all, some assets to do with that, but mainly Norse buildings and Norse assets for region maps and things. So that one is a slightly further on from sort of the dawn of civilization.
Exactly. And then we, like, to wrap it up, then we move along with Renaissance, which is more from the Age of Sail, Pirates of the Caribbean. It also is, I think, medieval and like, what do you call it? Crusade times, I think.
Yeah, for the most part, I think we're not going to do a lot of medieval, because that's going to be covered in the base setting for Deos, for in the sense of its kind of base fantasy. That we're going to contain a lot of that, but we're going to try and like introduce like a few like specific like Crusader things, or that particular area is also going to, that particular vote is also going to contain things like Aztecs and Mayans and Mesoamerican things specifically, of the big stuff that happened during the Age of Sail. But yeah.
Yeah, and then we move on into Victoriana, which is, I think, easy to explain. It's the Victorian time, Gothic buildings, steam powered, I think makes sense in there. Dark Goth in terms of vampire stuff, but we are already covered here by Dead House Sonata. So we're trying to focus away from the undead vampiristic approach more into the historical approach there, right?
Yes, true. And also a little bit more steampunky. So we're going to have a lot more. That's why we've called it Victoriana instead of Victorian, because we want to do a little bit more of a slightly more fantastical, interesting, fictional sort of
approach there, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Right, and then we have finally for Earth-based settings the modern era, which is like around 21st century. So the world of today, the cities, railways, highways, airports, engineering. So kind of a little post-industrial. Do you call it like that?
I suppose. I think it's hard to tell because obviously I could draw thousands of assets for different buildings for modern day, just looking at different cities. But it's generally going to be around today, the sort of time that we are in now, the present, and looking at what we could do to create more realistic roads and railways and putting those assets in the city map generator and also the region and world maps.
Perfect. So we have those 5 settings for History of Earth. And we said we want to give you 3 votes on those settings, which means that you can, in the voting tool, you will get the link through the Kickstarter notification system, so the message system from Kickstarter. And you will get a link to the voting tool. And there you will be able to place 3 votes. So checkbox 3 of those options there on History of Earth settings. We decided to split that amongst different settings or different setting categories, just to make sure that you not only, like, we're not getting overwhelmed by fantasy requests, because we want to make sure that we cover a huge base of different settings. And so we decided to give you 3 votes on the History of Earth category and 2 votes on fantasy and sci-fi. Now in fantasy, I think it's pretty self-explaining. We have the inner planes, the outer planes, the elemental planes, the underdark, aquatic setting, and high fantasy. Is there anything particular you want to point out, Mark?
I should unmute myself. Yeah, I think that generally speaking, a lot of this stuff is going to be very, very different. So when you look at the history of Earth, a lot of the stuff is going to be more realistic. So we're going to be basing off of history buildings. We're going to be basing off of things from the Romans and the Greeks and a few mythological things. So we might find like an asset for a, Cerberus from the Greek underworld or something like that, which might be fun to put on a map, but it's mainly going to be based around history. When you look at the fantasy section, most of that is going to be completely changing everything up. It's going to be different biomes, a lot of very, very strange and wonderful assets that are going to really make your world seem very, very fantasy-like and very, magical. Especially if you vote for any of the planes, because these are going to be taking place in the Feywild and the Shadowfell and all of these weird and wonderful places. So the fantasy section, if you're voting for any fantasy things, you're effectively trying to pick a really cool biome. And it goes the same way for something like the Underdark or the Aquatic. It's a completely different look for the maps. And we will have to do a lot of work for something like Aquatic and Underdark, but they will be a completely different look.
Exactly. So that's why we've called them heavy on biomes, because it means that a lot of the biomes will change to reflect that you are on a different plane. Mm-hmm. As you just said, for Underdark and Aquatic, it means that we might even have to change the way that land masses look, because an Underdark, like an underground world, it has not it doesn't have land masses per se, but it has cave systems. So the way the land masses look might change.
Mhm.
The same goes for aquatic, because you don't really have underwater land masses, but you have those ravines and different heights of or depths, I should say, of the underwater levels. So this is something huge where we might need to go and look at each and every biome and possibly some of the drawing tools to reflect those settings.
Yeah.
Right. So that's fantasy. You can vote on 2 different fantasy settings, which will again heavily affect the way that we add biomes and mechanics to the system. And finally, we have sci-fi. Now, sci-fi is a bit of a weird category we've created, because I mean you can heavily discuss on whether post-apocalypse is sci-fi or not. But we tried to take different settings that we kind of see in the area of sci-fi and put them there, which is post-apocalypse, digital utopia, space travel, grimdark, and cyberpunk. And again, they are changing a lot of things because they are heavy on biomes as well as heavy on assets. So that's why we said they are heavy on both. We need to address both systems here technically, and you can vote on 2 of them. Is there anything specific you want to point out for sci-fi, Caeora?
I think I should just quickly mention that I think post-apocalyptic is self-explanatory in the sense of everybody kind of knows about, you know, like a zombie film or, you know, virus outbreak, or, you know, the world as we know it has collapsed. Digital utopia is something that you might have, or it's a setting based around kind of what we used to think would happen in the future, like a completely beautiful white sort of skyscrapers with like little trees coming out of it and flying cars, and everything is perfect. So it's a sci-fi civilization that's, you know, much better off than post-apocalyptic. So the 2 are kind of the opposite of one another, just in case anybody was confused about that. Grimdark is a completely different thing to post-apocalyptic, in the sense that grimdark is it's based on a much more advanced scientific level. So it's a sci-fi universe that has advanced very high up the chain, and then it's all kind of gone wrong, but not collapsed like post-apocalyptic. I think if people vote for 21st century on the history of Earth settings, and they vote for post-apocalyptic, that'll make my life much easier, because a lot of those assets will be probably the same, in the sense that the 21st century assets will be used, then destroyed for post-apocalyptic. So there's a lot of there's a little bit of overlap with some of these, in the sense that you could argue that some of these are going to be very similar. Maybe Till just mentioned, you could possibly say that post-apocalyptic should be like, you know, under the history of Earth, because that's what happens after. That's what may happen to us. But yeah, generally speaking, you've got, these are all slightly different variants of sci-fi, and they will look very different.
Yeah, I mean, post-apocalyptic worlds have been requested a lot, and there have been different ends to our world, like the virus, the bomb, plants taking over, zombies rising. So we are going to try and cover those through different, possibly landmarks or special buildings that you can use to flavor up a map and say, okay, you know, this, like the giant crater where the nuke has exploded. This would be a good indication for that this world was bombed to death. Whereas if you have giant overgrown skyscrapers that are partially collapsed, this could be a good explanation that the virus has spread and that the plants are now taking over. And if you have giant I don't know, giant fortifications against zombies, that would be something that you would place in a zombie infested world. So technically they all come down to the end of the world as we know it. And now some flavor assets will give you the tools to your hand that you can make them unique to why the world has ended. And the same goes for Digital Utopia, because we have had requests about Tron or some virtual reality worlds. And I think this is a good spot to put them, because hologram buildings could be in a perfect utopian world, as well as you could use them to say that those are virtual reality worlds, for example. So as you see, we've tried to take everything that you threw at us and mix and match them in a way that they make sense, especially for us, as we have to do that. And you can vote on 2 of them, and just keep in mind, all those settings can be mixed and matched. So that means that you could, if you're having a very unique special world, that is a crystalline world where zombies have risen, but grim dark spaceships take over, and all that's left is Aztec temples, then a combination of those settings should give you the tools to do that.
Yes, and I think it's also worth mentioning that a lot of people are going to be sad because all of these votes are really cool.
Yeah, they are. I had such a hard time to pick the favorites myself, because I was like, I want this, and oh no, wait, this too, and this too. So I know where you're going. Please say it.
Well, we do know that this is how people are going to be reacting, and especially when the votes actually come in, and somebody, or a lot of people are like, well, I really wanted this. It's like, well, this is what's going to be in Deos pretty much at launch, possibly a little bit after, but generally this is what's going to be in Deos. That doesn't mean that these settings aren't going to be in Deos eventually. So later on down the line, these settings will be worked on and released. So if you really want a setting, then I'm sure that later on they'll all be done. You just have to be a little bit more patient.
Exactly. And also, it's still, I mean, the pledge manager is not released yet, and we don't know how much we will make through the pledge manager. So there's still the option. I have mentioned that on Discord, and I think in one of the videos, like I think the final live stream celebration we did. There might be still indefinite stretch goals that we unlock through the pledge manager, which might make sense to not do additional assets, but just to collect them and create an 8th setting to bring that post-launch. It will definitely be post-launch. We will not be able to do it before launch, but we are still looking at the option to take those additional assets that you have achieved through the indefinite stretch goals and make sure that we use them meaningful for you, because it doesn't make sense if we realize that we can cover a setting with probably 200 assets, but you have added 300 on them to just do 300 meaningless assets in there just to fulfill that. But it would make more sense to take those, park them, and do an additional setting instead.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot more sense, especially if the voting is close. I think because we won't do another vote. We'll just look at the votes that have come in through this and say, what do people really want? And what do people, how close are things?
The voting will, please take part in the vote, each and every one of you, because the voting is going to be our roadmap for the next settings that we are going to do. And the ones that win will be done until launch, but everything else is a good indication for us to see which is heavily requested next. So we can take this and work the list off step by step, just by having your votes there and knowing what you have been requesting. Right. I think that's it. You will find wherever close to here in this Kickstarter update. So if you're watching this on YouTube, follow the link to the Kickstarter update. This is going to be a locked update because we only want backers to vote on the settings. We don't want to have everyone vote on it because we want to make sure that you, as our supporters, get your vote. So if you're seeing this, go to our Kickstarter update. If you are on our Kickstarter update, just look for the link and check your emails, because you should have received an email with the link to our voting tool. And with that said, thank you and happy voting. Bye.